I married Joseph Davis from Boonesboro, Western Maryland, and we immediately moved to Maryland. And we settled in this little small town of about 1,000 inhabitants bearing the euphonious name of Funkstown. It's situated on the Antietam Creek about 8 miles from here. Now, by some of the Marylanders, I was called a Yankee. For you see, anyone born north of the Masons and Dixons line bore that appellation, but it depended very much upon how that word was pronounced or the emphasis, whether I was receiving a compliment or not. We had a large country store consisting of groceries, drugs, and footwear, and we lived in a comfortable brick house about 1 block away. The secession feeling was very strong. Most of my neighbors were what were called rebels. On the morning of April 12, 1861, the first gun of the Civil War was discharged from a Confederate battery, and a terrific bombardment of 34 hours duration followed. Strange to say, not a man was killed on either side. Fort Sumter was attacked, and the Stars and Stripes were lowered. And when the news reached the Confederate portion of our community, there was great rejoicing among them. Mr. Davis and I, both strong and ardent Union supporters, had a handsome flag at the front door of our house, and one night it was taken down and torn to shreds and scattered all over the steps and pavement. You might imagine how I felt when I realized that any American would perform such a perverted act as to tear our glorious Stars and Stripes into fragments and scatter them on the highway to be trampled underfoot. My nearest neighbors, my closest friends, were rebels. It made it very unpleasant. You see, my husband had 2 brothers who were strong Union men, while 2 others and 2 sisters were secessionists. But before this political excitement, I had never met with a kinder or more tender-hearted people in my life. And although during the summer of 1862, we would again and again hear reports that General Lee was planning to cross the Potomac into Maryland, the loyal portion of our community never thought he could do so, and secessionists were just wishing he would come. When the news reached us that he had crossed and was in Frederick City, I convinced Mr. Davis that he had to go north, because we had heard stories about these Confederates taking these Union men as prisoner and treating them just dreadfully. Mr. Davis closed the store, commenced packing his most valuable papers, distributed others around town, and he brought home his money and bank books, and we hid them in the old iron wash kettle by digging a hole and covering it with boards and dirt and chips, and no one knowing but ourselves where it was. I hired a local farm boy with a wagon, and he left for Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And the next morning, true enough, as we looked up the street, about 40,000 rebels were on their way through town. With the heavy tramp of the infantry and the rattling of cavalry and the rumble of artillery and baggage wagons all day and all night. They were a poor, forlorn-looking set of men who were tired, dirty, and ragged. Their coats were made of almost anything, but butternut color did predominate. I felt sorry for them, and I had 2 or 3 tin cups and some buckets of water. And sometimes when I would feel brave, I would tell them I wasn't in sympathy with their cause. And to this, they would ask me if the water was poisoned. One of the men gave an officer a cup of water, and he said, "A Yankee lady is giving us this water." And the officer said, "Well, if that's so, then I shall not drink a drop," put spurs to his horse, threw down the cup, and took off. It seemed as if the men came out of the ground like locusts. General Lee passed through town. He was such an elegant-looking gentleman. He was riding in a common ambulance, surrounded by 6 soldiers armed to the teeth and the palmetto flag floating above it. He had had his arm in a sling because he had had an accident involving his horse. He was establishing his headquarters in Hagerstown. And in a few days, it was rumored that the rear guard of General Lee's army had been attacked by troops under the command of General McClellan between Boonesboro and Middletown at South Mountain. General Lee sent word to us that we would have a battle in our midst and should prepare our cellars as places of safety. And I packed up photographs I brought from home, burned letters, and my house soon looked as if I was moving or just cleaning. And on Tuesday, September 16th, Mr. Davis returned home. And on Wednesday, September 17th, the tide of the battle seemed to surge to and fro. And instead of culminating in Funkstown as we expected, General Lee was forced to retreat over Antietam Creek towards Sharpsburg. Mr. Davis went to the battleground that morning, and he met with the soldiers. and they told him that government supplies had failed to reach the troops and that they were in desperate need of food. That evening, when he returned home, he sent word to rebel and Union families that if they would prepare food and bring it to us, we would see that it was taken to the battlefield the next day. And I stayed up all night cooking, and the next morning my kitchen, laundry house, dining room was filled with jars and crocks of mashed potatoes, ham, fried chicken, beef sandwiches, in fact anything that a small country town could provide. And we took 5 or 6 women and loaded a wagon. It seemed as if everyone in the county was going in the same direction, and after riding about 8 miles, we came upon this beautiful farmhouse, surrounded by carriage houses, corn cribs, haystacks, gardens, giving evidence of a prosperous and well-to-do farmer. Imagine yourself driving up to this house and finding it deserted by the family. All the heavy furniture removed, every available space occupied by wounded and dying human beings. When we stepped out of the carriage, there were about 2,000 pallid and death-like looking men, mangled, bleeding and torn, lying on the ground, and others being brought in and placed wherever room could be found. While we were standing there, one of the officers approached us and asked if we had anyone we were particularly interested in. We told him no and took a basket from the wagon and followed. And we found his soldiers lying 3 and 4 deep around a haystack, suffering. While I was standing there, one of the men looked up at me and said, "Thirza, is that you?" And the surgeon nodded to me, and I knelt down and I took his hand, and he again said, "Thirza, I knew you would come." And do you know that in a moment his spirit quietly and sweetly passed away to the shore where war and rumor of war heard of no more. I've often wished I could meet Thirza so I could tell her. Her husband supposed that she was with him while he was dying. From there I went to where they were burying the dead. And I plucked branches from the apple trees and threw them in the deep trenches. A boy was standing there telling me about someone wounded from New York in the front lawn. And I followed and found Captain Clark of the 107th New York and invited him to my house to be cared for. And he came to me on Saturday. And that Tuesday I heard about a woman who was in Hagerstown from New York with a physician desperately trying to find a boy. And my husband said, "I can't sleep unless we see if this is his mother," and it was. And she became our house guest too. And that Friday, her physician and myself rode over to the battleground. We went to General McClellan's headquarters and found that he had already left for Harper's Ferry. There were still so many men lying on the ground suffering for the necessaries of life, nothing but little shelter tents covering them, complaining of the cold and the want for something to eat. In leaving you this evening, I remember one place I went that day. I went to where they were burying the dead. I saw so many new graves. The Union boys, you see, had little pieces of board with their names on, while a great many of the Confederates had none because their names were not even known. But in this one field, there was a Union soldier buried alone with these words penciled on the board at the head of his grave. A Union soldier who freely spilt his blood for the Stars and Stripes. His memory will be cherished as a lover of his country by succeeding generations.